What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands 3 video for you guys, and today I figured I'd go over 10 of what I think are among the worst legendary guns and weapons in Borderlands 3. Now real quick, and before we start, it is worth mentioning that most legendaries in Borderlands 3 are pretty good, and thus, it was actually kind of hard to put together this video. With that said, I'm only including legendaries that I'm aware of or that I know about, and I'm also including legendaries that I perceive to be flawed rather than just low tier or whatever. After all, I could name a dozen low tier legendaries that I've found better non-unique counterparts for. And of course, it wouldn't be right if I didn't ask you guys to smash like on this video to help prevent the tinks from coming and taking all of your legendaries. And failing that, you could always just let me know in the comment section below what your personal worst legendary is. But without further ado, these are the top 10 worst legendary guns and weapons in Borderlands 3. Don't climb that tree. Number 10. The Tunguska. The Tunguska is a Generation 1 pearlescent from Borderlands 2, and though it may not be quite as bad as it once was, I do think you'll end up agreeing there are just better options out there in Borderlands 3. That, and I've recently been getting a ton of these for completing the main story, and I've experienced disappointment each time that's happened. So that's why it's appearing on this list. In my mind, the problem with the Tunguska is that it's a legendary launcher in a field of legendary launchers that are just way cooler, more fun to use, and or are just simply more effective. And as far as that last point goes, you always have to wait for the Tunguska's secondary rocket to go off, and the base damage of the Tunguska seems noticeably lower than the likes of the Scourge, Quatomizer, Ruby's Wrath, or the Freeman as examples. So with this in mind, I think you'll find the average legendary launcher seems to deal more damage, and it deals it more quickly, thus making the Tunguska a less practical option. Ultimately, I think you'll agree there's just better stuff out there, and while it's nice to see the Tunguska return with a few improvements, I think you'll wish you had other legendary launchers. Again, I've found these when you beat the game, though you can find them from other loot sources as well. Number 9. The Long Musket. As a big fan of TDR, I feel bad putting this one on the list. After all, the Long Musket is basically a portable flamethrower, and flamethrowers are a lot of fun. Additionally, the Long Musket has the benefits of spawning with turret legs, allowing you to have an automated flamethrower chasing enemies down, which is pretty cool to watch. Unfortunately, the Long Musket is also kind of terrible. While the base damage or flamethrower aspect of this weapon can be impressive and will often exceed other non-unique TDR SMGs, it ultimately ends up coming at the cost of greatly reduced range, and the even bigger issue which revolves around its reload damage. As you can see from some of the gameplay, the reload damage is in the single digits, which makes the Long Musket basically impossible to use as a conventional TDR. You do get this really cool rocket effect when you reload over a greater distance, but I've often found you're better off with non-unique TDR SMGs since they will usually have better reload damage potential. In the end, the Long Musket can be a fun toy to play around with, though I do think you can do better as far as TDR weapons go. So if you find one, you don't necessarily need to throw it out, but you may find other TDRs are better. Number 8. The 10-gallon. Like the Long Musket, I feel sort of bad putting this one on the list. After all, the 10-gallon has a pretty unique and innovative design in that reloading the weapon causes it to act more like a hovering sentry turret. The effect is kind of like if you're dual wielding, however you don't exercise precise control over the turret, it just sort of has a mind on its own and it will auto-target enemies and then fire. However, the 10-gallon is making it onto this list for a couple of reasons. For starters, sentry-style TDR weapons already exist with turret legs, and in my opinion, those tend to be better due to the fact that those types of guns will run into and explode on enemies dealing damage, while the 10-gallon just can't do that. Additionally, the sentry itself has to be reloaded in order to continue firing, and on top of that, the targeting AI is pretty dumb. The likelihood of it missing is pretty high, and should an enemy get behind cover, well, the 10-gallon will continue to fire, wasting ammo. Again, I hate the fact that I have to hate on this thing since it's a cool idea, but I'd really rather just stick to regular TDRs. Maybe this thing will eventually get massively buffed at some point in the future, but for now I'm gonna have to take a pass. Number 7. The Night Flyer. While I get it's sort of a joke, I'm sorry to say that the Night Flyer is pretty abysmal. After all, a gun that literally can't kill enemies is pretty useless, especially when you consider that even many of the other guns and weapons on this list that are worse can actually successfully kill enemies. As you've likely noticed from the gameplay, the Night Flyer's special effect allows it to deal just enough damage to enemies to where they have a sliver of health left. After that, enemies gain immunity to the Night Flyer's bullets, and the only way to actually kill an enemy at that point is to switch to another weapon, melee the enemy, or inflict a damage over time effect. At this stage of Borderlands 3's development, I don't really see much point in being able to almost kill something. Maybe this will change, but for now, the Night Flyer is just a novelty that isn't really worth the effort. Maybe you could use it to help low-level co-op partners or something, but even then, you're probably better off using better weapons. Again, maybe this will become way better in the future, but for now, I think you're better off using just about any other weapon. If you want it, I managed to get mine from Rackman during week 2 of the Borderlands anniversary event, though I think you'll agree this thing really isn't worth it. Number 6. The Widowmaker. Even after getting a Merv variant of this thing, I feel I can still confidently say that the Widowmaker kinda sucks. Heck, even the Diamond Butt Bomb that you get from getting one of the special editions of Borderlands 3 is better, and I'm inclined to say that it's even on the lower end of the spectrum as far as Legendaries go. Ironically, and with the grenade build, the damage on the Widowmaker can actually be pretty decent. Assuming you get an elemental variant and that element matches the corresponding weakness of the enemies you're fighting, the damage should be pretty good. The issue, or should I say issues, are that the Widowmaker's homing grenades take too long to go off, and depending on how they land on a surface, they can easily deploy downwards below a map or into an object and explode, negating much of the potential damage. Because of these two factors, I think you'll find that the Widowmaker is just kind of a pain to use. I'll admit the Merv variants are definitely better, but that can be said of just about any other grenade that can have a Merv variant. I managed to get mine randomly as I was playing through the game, but trust me, it's best if you avoid the Widowmaker if possible. Number 5. The Bearcat. Some things never change, but I think it's fair to say that just like Borderlands 2, the Bearcat is still pretty terrible in Borderlands 3. Funnily enough, the Bearcat can now perform criticals in Borderlands 3, which was a major issue with it and many of the other Grenadier assault rifles in Borderlands 2. However, many of the same issues that are present before still reside. The ammo consumption is lower this time around, consuming 4 ammo instead of 6. However, I think you'll agree that the Bearcat is still a massive ammo hog relative to the amount of damage it deals. And of course, the Bearcat's horizontal projectile formation doesn't do it any favors. It may work against larger enemies, but beyond that, I think you'll agree the damage potential here is pretty mediocre against smaller and regular mob-type enemies. All things considered, I think you can find weapons that work well against large enemies that consume less ammo, and aren't as difficult to perform criticals with. So in the end, I think you'll agree that you're pretty much better off with almost anything else. Number 4. The Storm. To be honest with you guys, I'd much rather talk about the Firestorm. Surprisingly, it's actually pretty decent, even if it's a straight-up copy of the Firestorm grenade in sniper rifle form. But unfortunately, we are going to have to talk about the Storm. As many longtime fans of the channel likely know at this point, I've been a virulent detractor of the Storm ever since it got introduced in Borderlands 2. I will admit that in some ways it isn't as bad in Borderlands 3 as the base damage isn't way too low like it was in Borderlands 2, but it's got some aggravating new problems in Borderlands 3. In particular, probably the biggest issue revolves around how this thing fires. Unlike other Malwant snipers, which have to charge up and fire while holding and then releasing the trigger, or maybe something like the Krakatoa or Firestorm, which will fire continuously after they're fully charged, the Storm fires as soon as it's fully charged, and then has to recharge in between each shot. Not only does this lower the sniper's DPS potential, but it both makes precise pinpoint shots near impossible and reduces the Storm's spam potential, which makes taking advantage of the Tesla orbs unnecessarily more difficult. Funnily enough, the Storm could possibly be fixed if it functioned more like the Firestorm does. Obviously, it will probably never be massively OP, but it could be a fun gun to use against Iridians and the like. As it is now, though, I think it's fair to say that it's kind of terrible, and when you do come across it, I think you'll agree with me in that you should just get a Firestorm Sniper instead. Number 3. The TKs Wave. Whether it's the TKs Wave in Borderlands 1, the Tidal Wave in Borderlands 2, or the TKs Wave again in Borderlands 3, this gun has just never been any good. Even though it achieves its legendary status for the first time in Borderlands 3, I think you'll find that that doesn't really do much to improve the weapon's standing. After all, you're still getting slow-moving sine wave projectiles that are oriented in a horizontal pattern that makes hitting anything almost impossible. You essentially have to be almost point-blank when you fire, and even then, there's little guarantee that you'll actually hit whatever it is that you're shooting at. The other issue you can sometimes find with this thing is low magazine size. When combined with all of the other issues, it can just make this gun way harder to use. Fortunately, you can get versions like the one I have here that have a magazine size of more than 2. However, just keep in mind if you get one of these with just a magazine of 2, then that variant is really the worst version of the TKs Wave in my opinion. In the end, I don't suspect the TKs Wave will ever go away, as it's a staple of the franchise at this point, but I do wish that it would get revamped for the better. If you want this thing, just keep an eye out for it, as I've seen it drop randomly. Number 2. The Hunterseeker. Even under ideal circumstances with either a cloning or MIRV prefix, I think the Hunterseeker is pretty terrible. For the uninitiated, the Hunterseeker is a grenade mod that, when thrown, will sort of home in on enemies firing conventional style bullets. Assuming the grenade comes into contact with an enemy, it should explode, dealing some damage. Now, while this may sound like a great idea in concept, as it's kind of like throwing a portable drone, there are of course some issues. In particular, the Hunterseeker seems to have a tendency for its homing mode not to work. Thus, you'll frequently encounter situations where you'll throw this thing, and it will just go right into a surface and explode, rather than homing in on an enemy. I think the biggest issue with the Hunterseeker, though, is that it just doesn't seem to have good synergy with a grenade-style build. Because the bullets fired don't deal splash damage, you don't have a chance of regenerating a grenade on Moes, which makes this thing less useful in my mind. Add on some of the aforementioned issues with the homing mode just deciding not to work and the wonky accuracy on the bullets, and I think you'll agree you can do a lot better. I guess if you're curious, I've managed to get these to drop from Captain Trant, though I just recommend you hold out and try to get a good hex grenade from him instead. And finally, number 1, the Lob. So the Lob is kind of awful for a number of reasons, however, probably the most obvious reason largely has to do with its item card. With a negative 76% weapon damage debuff on the version I have here, you've got a vague idea that you're probably going to be in for some massive disappointment. However, what I would say really makes the Lob terrible is its projectile. From what I can tell, this thing can't crit, and instead, the orb emitted will literally pass through the enemies you fire it at, and will only explode provided the orb comes into contact with a hard surface, or after the orb travels a certain distance, which, as you might expect, isn't very far. To get the best use out of this thing, you have to fire it at a group of enemies that are in a line, and then hope you get the distance right so the orb explodes on those enemies dealing damage. It's a lot of calculations and precision for something that doesn't even really deal that much damage in the first place. And besides, if you're looking for a decent splash damage weapon for your build, why not use something that both deals damage and can actually perform criticals to further improve your damage output? At the end of the day, I think this is the worst legendary I've found so far, so if you get it to drop, you may just want to walk past it. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely be sure to smash like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload my next video, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.